Sometimes a man runs so far from his past that he forgets what he was running toward. Jesse McRae, at 63 years old, had spent more nights under bridges than he cared to count, carrying nothing but worn boots, a weathered coat, and regrets heavy enough to break a younger man's back. With his last $15, he bought a broken-down ranch at a tax auction, a place nobody else wanted. He wasn't looking to rebuild anything. He just wanted a quiet place to be forgotten. But the old ranch had secrets buried in its bones. Hidden beneath the floorboards were letters from a woman who once waited, and a child's drawings signed with his last name. What had this land been trying to tell him all these years? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. And if this touches you, subscribe. Tomorrow I've got something very special. The late afternoon sun painted the Montana prairie in shades of amber and gold when Jesse McRae first laid eyes on what his $15 had bought him. The pickup truck that had given him a ride from the county courthouse rumbled away down the dirt road, leaving him standing at the property line with nothing but the clothes on his back and a crumpled tax auction receipt in his pocket. The ranch stretched out before him like a broken promise. Wooden fence posts leaned at drunken angles, their wire strands sagging or snapped entirely. The main gate hung from a single rusted hinge, creating a gap wide enough to walk through without bothering to open it. Beyond the fence line, wild prairie grass grew waist-high, punctuated by the skeletal remains of what had once been cultivated fields. The barn stood about 100 yards to the left, or rather, what was left of it stood. The roof had collapsed on one side, and the walls that remained upright were weathered to a silver grey that spoke of decades without paint or care. A few pieces of rusted equipment sat half-buried in the weeds nearby, the curved blade of an old plough, the wheel rim of some forgotten machine. But it was the house that held Jesse's attention. A single-story structure with a sagging front porch. It sat on a slight rise overlooking the property. The windows were dark and empty, some still holding fragments of glass, others boarded over with planks that had themselves begun to rot. The roof appeared mostly intact, though a few shingles were missing here and there. The front door hung slightly ajar, moving gently in the prairie wind with a creaking sound that carried across the distance. Jesse shifted the weight of his worn duffel bag on his shoulder and started walking. His boots, held together more by habit than leather at this point, crunched through the dry grass. He was a tall man, though his shoulders had developed the slight stoop that comes from years of trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. His hands were weathered and scarred, the hands of someone who had worked with them his entire life. Even if that work had become increasingly sporadic over the years, his face told a story he rarely shared with anyone. Deep lines creased his forehead and framed his mouth, carved by 63 years of living, the last 15 or so spent mostly outdoors regardless of season. His hair, more grey than brown now, hung past his collar, and his beard was long and untrimmed. But it was his eyes that revealed the most, pale blue, carrying a weight that made people look away when they met his gaze. They were the eyes of a man who had seen things he wished he could forget and done things he never would. As he approached the house, Jesse noticed details that the distance had hidden. The porch steps were solid, surprisingly so, though the railing had gaps where balusters had broken away or been removed. The front door's hinges were rusty but still attached. A dusty window to the left of the door showed darkness inside. He climbed the 3 steps carefully, testing each one before putting his full weight on it. The porch boards groaned but held. Standing before the door, Jesse felt an odd hesitation, as if he were about to intrude on something sacred or private. He shook off the feeling. The place was his now, bought and paid for with his last bit of money. He pushed the door open wider. The hinges protested with a long, mournful squeal that seemed to echo through the empty rooms beyond. Jesse stepped inside and paused, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that came through the broken windows. The air inside was stale and thick, carrying the scent of old wood and abandonment. He stood in what had once been a living room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel still intact despite the years. The floor was wooden, scuffed and dirty, but mostly sound from what he could see. To his right, a doorway led to what appeared to be a kitchen. Straight ahead, a short hallway suggested bedrooms beyond. Jesse set his duffel bag down and began a more thorough exploration. The kitchen still held an old wood-burning stove, though the pipe that should have connected it to the chimney lay rusted on the floor. Cabinets hung open, their doors askew, revealing empty shelves. A pump handle stood over a deep sink, a good sign that there might be a well. He tried the pump, working the handle up and down. It resisted at first, stiff from disuse, but he kept at it. After a dozen strokes, the mechanism began to loosen. After 24 more, water sputtered out, brown and gritty at first, then gradually clearing. Jesse cupped his hands under the flow and tasted it. Cold, with a mineral tang, but clean enough. He drank deeply, realizing just how thirsty the long day had made him. The hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom. The bathroom was in the worst shape. The fixtures were beyond repair, and part of the floor had rotted through. But the bedrooms, while empty and dirty, seemed structurally sound. The larger bedroom had windows facing east, and Jesse imagined morning light flooding through them once the glass was cleaned or replaced. In the smaller bedroom, he found the only piece of furniture left in the house, an old rocking chair with a broken runner. It sat in the corner as if waiting for someone to return and make it whole again. Something about that chair tugged at Jesse in a way he couldn't quite name. As the sun began to set, Jesse made his preparations for the night. He had slept in worse places, under highway overpasses, in abandoned buildings, in the woods when the weather allowed. At least here he had walls and a roof, protection from the elements. He swept a clear space on the living room floor, using a piece of cardboard he found in the kitchen, then laid out his bedroll, an ancient sleeping bag that had seen better decades. His duffel bag held everything he owned, a change of clothes, some basic toiletries, a mess kit from his service days, a flashlight with dying batteries, and at the very bottom, wrapped in an old T-shirt, a pistol he hadn't fired in years. He'd carried that weapon through more than one war, and through even more years of civilian life that sometimes felt like its own kind of combat. He left it wrapped and buried at the bottom of the bag. As darkness settled over the prairie, Jesse sat on the porch steps and watched the stars emerge. The isolation that had drawn him to this place now pressed in around him, but it was a different kind of loneliness than he'd known on the streets. There he was surrounded by people, but utterly alone. Here, the solitude felt almost companionable, as if the land itself was keeping him company. He thought about the town he'd passed through on the way to the auction. Redemption Creek, the signs had said. Population 847. The kind of small Montana town where everybody knew everybody else's business, where newcomers were noticed and strangers were remembered. He'd stayed just long enough to complete the auction paperwork at the courthouse, avoiding conversation, keeping his head down. It was about 15 miles back down the highway, close enough to walk to if he needed supplies, far enough away to maintain his privacy. Memories stirred in Jesse's mind as he sat in the darkness, fragments of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He remembered wearing a uniform, the weight of it, the responsibility it carried. He remembered the sound of helicopters and the crack of rifles, the smell of smoke and fear. He remembered coming home from all that, changed in ways he couldn't articulate, angry at things he couldn't name, and he remembered a woman's face, young and hopeful, looking at him with an expression he hadn't deserved even then. The memory was hazy, like looking through dirty water, but the emotion attached to it was sharp and clear, shame, deep and abiding. Jesse shook his head, pushing the memories back down where they belonged. That was another life, another version of himself. That man had made choices that led to consequences, and those consequences had put him on a path that ended here, on the porch of a broken-down ranch he'd bought with his last $15. He went inside as the temperature dropped, the prairie night turning cold the way it always did, even in late spring. He climbed into his sleeping bag fully clothed and lay on the hard floor, staring up at the ceiling he could barely see in the darkness. The house settled around him with creaks and sighs, the sounds of an old structure adjusting to having someone inside its walls again. Sleep came fitfully. Jesse had learned long ago to sleep light, always half aware of his surroundings, ready to wake at the first sign of danger. But here, the only sounds were natural ones. The wind moving through the broken windows, the distant call of an owl, the scurrying of some small creature in the walls. When dawn came, it came with a gentleness that surprised him. Light filtered through the dirty windows, painting the bare walls in soft shades of rose and gold. Jesse rose stiffly, his joints complaining about the hard floor, and stepped outside to watch the sun clear the horizon. The morning light transformed the property, revealing details the dusk had hidden. He could see now that the fence line ran roughly in a rectangle, enclosing what looked like about 40 acres. Not much by Montana standards, but more land than Jesse had ever owned in his life. The collapsed barn drew his attention again, and he walked over to inspect it more closely. Despite its condition, some of the structure remained salvageable. The walls on two sides were still reasonably solid, and enough of the roof trusses remained intact that Jesse thought he might be able to stabilize it with some work. He had no animals to shelter, but having a barn was part of what made a ranch, and something in him wanted to honor that, walking the property line. Jesse discovered other remnants of the ranch's past life. An old water trough rusted through at the bottom. A chicken coop collapsed, but still recognizable. Posts that had once supported clotheslines. Each relic told a story of people who had lived here, worked here, tried to make a life in this hard country. Near the eastern fence line, he found an old well pump standing sentinel over a concrete pad. He worked the handle, hoping for the same success he'd had with the kitchen pump. This one was more stubborn, but eventually it too gave up its grudge and produced water. The flow was stronger here than inside the house, and Jesse realized this must have been the main well. Having two sources of good water was a stroke of fortune he hadn't expected. As he walked back toward the house, his eye caught something he'd missed the night before. A mailbox at the property's entrance, where the driveway met the main road. It was leaning heavily to one side, rusted and dented, but still standing. Curious, Jesse walked over to it. The mailbox had been red once, though only patches of color remained. But it was what he saw on the side that made him stop and stare. Partially obscured by rust and weathering, letters were still barely visible, spelled out in faded paint, McRae. Jesse stood there for a long moment, the morning sun warming his back, staring at his own name on a mailbox he hadn't known existed until that moment. This ranch, this broken-down piece of Montana prairie, had belonged to someone named McRae. The name wasn't common, but it wasn't rare either. Could be coincidence, he told himself. Could be some distant relation he'd never known about, but standing there, looking at those letters, Jesse felt something shift inside his chest. This place had called his name long before he'd ever seen it. The tax auction listing had simply said, Property 3847, with no history, no details. He'd chosen it because it was the cheapest lot available, because he could afford it with his last few dollars. But now he wondered if there had been something more at work, some invisible thread connecting him to this land. He walked back to the house with a new sense of purpose. He might not know why the universe had led him here, but he knew one thing. He had a place to stay, water to drink, and walls to shelter him from the elements. For a man who had spent recent years with none of those things, it was enough. More than enough. Jesse spent the rest of the morning making the house more livable. He found a broom in the kitchen closet, its bristles stiff with age but serviceable. He swept the living room and the larger bedroom thoroughly, creating clouds of dust that made him cough. He wiped down the windows with an old rag dampened with well water, letting in more light. He checked every corner of the structure for signs of serious damage or danger and found the bones of the house were solid, even if the flesh needed work. By noon, sweat dampened his shirt despite the cool spring air. He sat on the porch steps and ate a can of beans he'd been saving, using the church key on his pocket knife to open it. The beans were cold and congealed, but they filled his stomach. He washed them down with fresh well water, thinking that for all his years on the road, he'd rarely had a meal with a better view. The prairie stretched out before him in rolling waves of grass and wildflowers, interrupted here and there by stands of cottonwood trees that marked where water collected. In the distance, mountains rose against the horizon, their peaks still carrying snow that gleamed white in the sunlight. The sky was an endless blue, decorated with clouds that cast moving shadows across the land. Jesse McRae sat on those porch steps and felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Not happiness, he wasn't sure he'd recognize that anymore, but something closer to peace, or at least the distant possibility of it. He had a place now. It wasn't much, but it was his. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The broken floorboard announced itself on Jesse's third morning at the ranch. He'd been walking from the living room toward the bedroom when his boot caught on an edge that shouldn't have been there. Looking down, he saw that one of the boards had separated from its neighbors, creating a gap wide enough to catch a toe. Jesse knelt and examined the damage. The board was old pine, darkened with age, and the nails that should have held it secure had either pulled free or rusted away to nothing. It would be a simple enough fix. Hammer it back down or replace it entirely. The board shifted under his hand, loose and unstable. He went to his duffel bag and retrieved the small set of tools he carried, a hammer, some nails he'd collected over the years, a screwdriver that had seen better days. The tools were old friends, carried through more jobs than he could count, back when he'd worked construction between the drinking and the wandering. His hands remembered their weight, remembered the satisfaction of fixing things, even when he couldn't fix himself. Returning to the bedroom, Jesse used the hammer's claw to pry up the loose board completely. It came away with surprising ease, revealing the support joists beneath. He peered into the gap, checking for rot or structural damage in the subflooring. The space looked sound enough, but something caught his eye in the shadows. Lodged between two joists was a small wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, coated in dust and cobwebs. Jesse reached down and pulled it free, his heart beginning to beat faster for reasons he couldn't immediately explain. The box was old, made of cedar from the feel of it, and surprisingly heavy for its size. He carried it to the window where the light was better and brushed away the worst of the dust and webs. The box had a simple latch, rusted but not locked. Jesse's hands trembled slightly as he worked the latch free. The hinges protested with a soft squeak as he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in what had once been a faded blue ribbon, was a bundle of envelopes. Below them, a few other items, a small photograph, a pressed flower, a tarnished ring. But it was the letters that drew Jesse's attention. The envelopes were yellowed with age, addressed in neat feminine handwriting. He lifted the bundle carefully, feeling the weight of the paper, the care with which someone had tied that ribbon and hidden this box away. The name on the top envelope made Jesse's breath catch in his throat. Jesse McRae. General Delivery, Redemption Creek, Montana. His hands shook harder now as he untied the ribbon. It fell away in pieces, the fabric too old and fragile to hold together. He pulled out the top letter, noting the postmark, June 1983, with movements that felt dreamlike, disconnected from his body. Jesse unfolded the letter. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, neat, careful, each letter formed with obvious attention. He began to read. Jesse, I know you said not to write to you, that you needed to stay away, but I'm writing anyway. Our son turned 3 months old yesterday. He has your eyes, that same pale blue that looks gray in certain light. He's strong and healthy and so beautiful it makes my heart hurt. I call him Tommy, after your father like you wanted. I hope that's still all right. I hope you're somewhere safe. I hope you're getting help. I miss you every day, but I understand why you left. I saw what the war did to you, and I know you're afraid of what you might do. But Jesse, you need to know, I don't blame you for what happened. You scared me that night, yes, but I knew it wasn't really you. It was the demons you brought home from that terrible place. Come back when you're ready. We're waiting. We'll always wait. All my love, Sarah. Jesse read the letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. A son. He had a son, Tommy, 3 months old in June 1983, which would make him, Jesse's mind struggled with the math, 42 years old now. A grown man, a man who had lived his entire life while Jesse wandered the country like a ghost. Sarah. The name brought back memories that crashed over him like waves. Sarah with the dark hair and the gentle smile. Sarah who had believed in him when he came back from Vietnam, broken and dangerous. Sarah who had loved him enough to let him go when he became a threat to her safety. He reached for the next letter with hands that could barely hold the paper. September 1983. Jesse, Tommy is sitting up now, almost ready to crawl. I'm working at the diner in town. Mrs. Hartwell watches him while I'm at work. Everyone here has been so kind, but they ask about you, and I don't know what to tell them. I say you're away working, that you'll come back when you can. I want to believe that. I need to believe that. Please write to me if you can. Even just a few words to know you're alive. I love you, Sarah. Letter after letter, Jesse read through the months and years of Sarah's life. January 1984, Tommy's first steps. June 1984, he said his first word, Mama. December 1984, his first Christmas. Sarah described decorating a small tree, buying Tommy a toy truck with money she'd saved, sitting alone on Christmas Eve and thinking about Jesse. The letters continued through 1985. 1986, 1987, Tommy starting school. Tommy asking about his father, Sarah's explanations growing more strained, more painful. Her words remained loving, but took on an edge of weariness, of hope wearing thin under the weight of years. Jesse, Tommy drew a picture of you today in school. He drew you as a cowboy because I told him you used to work with horses when you were young. He drew you so tall and strong, wearing a big hat. He put it on the refrigerator and tells everyone about his daddy. It breaks my heart a little more each time. Where are you? Are you even alive? I'm still at the ranch, our ranch, the one your father left you. I've kept it going as best I can, but it's hard. The land is hard. Everything is hard without you. But I'm still here. Still waiting. Sarah. The letters from 1988 showed a change in tone. Sarah's hope had transformed into something else. Acceptance, perhaps, or resignation. Jesse, I don't know if you'll ever read these letters. I don't know if you're alive or dead. But I keep writing them anyway, and I keep hiding them in our bedroom floor, in the place where you hid your father's watch that summer before you enlisted. Tommy is 8 now. He's a good boy, smart and kind. He's stopped asking about you as much. I think he's beginning to understand that some fathers don't come home. I've met someone, Reverend Whitfield and his wife from the church. They've offered to help with Tommy, to give him the stability I can't provide alone. I haven't decided yet. I still feel married to you, even though you've been gone for years, even though you might be dead for all I know. How long does a woman wait? How long before waiting becomes foolishness? I don't know anymore. I'm tired, Jesse, so tired. Sarah. The last letter was dated March 1989, and it was shorter than the others. Jesse, this is the last letter I'll write to you. I'm moving away from the ranch. I can't maintain it anymore, and the memories here are too heavy to carry. Tommy has been adopted by the Whitfields. They're good people, and they love him like their own. He'll have a better life with them than I could give him alone. The ranch will go to auction eventually when the taxes aren't paid, I suppose. Maybe someone will buy it and love it the way we should have. Maybe someone will find these letters someday and wonder about the woman who wrote them, and the man who never came home. I loved you, Jesse McRae. I loved you with everything I had. But love isn't always enough, is it? I hope you found whatever you were looking for out there in the world. I hope it was worth what you gave up to find it. Goodbye, Sarah. Jesse sat on the bedroom floor surrounded by the scattered letters. Their words blurring as tears. He hadn't cried in decades, finally broke free. His chest heaved with sobs that felt like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside him, from a place he'd sealed off and tried to forget existed. He had a son, had a wife who loved him, had owned this ranch, inherited from a father he barely remembered. And he'd thrown it all away, walked away from it because he'd been too broken, too scared, too damaged to stay and fight for it. The enormity of what he'd lost crushed down on him with a physical weight. 42 years. Tommy would be 42 years old now. A lifetime Jesse had missed while he drifted from town to town, bottle to bottle, bridge to bridge. Sarah had waited years for him, and he'd never come back. She'd raised their son alone until she couldn't anymore, until she'd had to give him away. And the cruelest irony of all, he'd come back to the ranch, to this exact place where Sarah had written these letters and hidden them in hope that he'd return and find them. But he'd come back 40 years too late, a broken old man with $15 to his name, buying back his own land because he was too far gone to even recognize it as his. The spring afternoon faded into evening as Jesse sat among the letters, reading and rereading them until he had memorized every word. The sun set beyond the window, painting the room in shades of orange and purple, then slowly dimming to darkness. When night had fully claimed the house, Jesse carefully gathered the letters and retied them with a piece of string from his duffel bag, the original ribbon having disintegrated in his hands. He placed them back in the cedar box, along with the photograph he hadn't yet looked at. The pressed flower, the tarnished ring. He replaced the floorboard, nailing it back down with careful, deliberate strikes of his hammer. Each blow of the hammer felt like a nail driven into his own heart, sealing away what he'd found, acknowledging what he'd lost. That night, Jesse McRae lay in his sleeping bag on the living room floor and stared at the dark ceiling, feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. He'd thought he'd hit bottom years ago, but he'd been wrong. Bottom was here now, in this house that had once been his home, holding letters from a woman who had loved him, learning about a son he'd never known. The weight of 40 lost years pressed down on him in the darkness, and Jesse wondered if redemption was even possible for a man who had run so far from his own life. Morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Jesse woke with swollen eyes and a headache that pulsed behind his temples, the physical aftermath of crying harder than he had since he was a child. He lay still for several minutes, watching dust motes drift through the early light before forcing himself to sit up. The events of the previous day felt both impossibly distant and painfully immediate. Part of him wanted to believe it had been some kind of fever dream, but the ache in his chest told him otherwise. He had a son somewhere in the world. He had been loved by a woman who deserved better than what he'd given her. After washing his face with cold water from the kitchen pump, Jesse returned to the bedroom. The replaced floorboard was a visible reminder, the newer nails bright against the old wood. But he wasn't looking at the floor anymore. His eyes traveled around the room with new purpose, searching for other traces of the life he'd abandoned. The closet door hung askew on broken hinges. Jesse pulled it fully open and peered into the shadows. Empty except for a few wire hangers and what looked like a child's shoe, just one, small and worn, its mate lost to time. Jesse picked it up, turning it over in his hands. A boy's shoe, probably size 2 or 3. Tommy's shoe. His son had lived in this room, played in this room, slept in this room. Jesse continued his search methodically. He looked behind the rocking chair, finding nothing but dust and dead insects. He checked the windowsill, running his fingers along the wood. Then he noticed the small gap between the window frame and the wall, where the plaster had cracked and pulled away slightly. Wedging his fingers into the gap, Jesse felt paper. He worked carefully, trying not to tear whatever was hidden there. Slowly, he extracted several pieces of paper, folded and pressed flat by time. They were drawings, done in crayon on paper that had yellowed at the edges. Jesse unfolded them with trembling hands and spread them out on the floor where the light was best. The first showed a house. This house, he realized, with a lopsided roof and oversized windows. A stick-figure woman stood in front and a smaller stick-figure beside her. A sun beamed down from a corner of the page, and flowers grew in improbable profusion around the house. In the bottom corner, in careful child's handwriting, "My house, Tommy McRae." Age 5, the second drawing depicted what appeared to be a battle scene. Soldiers rendered as stick figures with rectangular bodies faced each other across the page. Explosions were drawn as orange and red starbursts. In the center, one figure stood larger than the others, presumably the hero of the piece. "My dad the soldier," the caption read in that same careful hand, but it was the third drawing that made Jesse's throat tighten. This one showed a man on horseback, the horse drawn with more care than skill, the man wearing what was clearly meant to be a cowboy hat. The figure sat tall in the saddle, and even through the crude lines of a child's drawing, there was something proud and strong about the image. A child's idealized vision of his father. The caption read simply, "My Daddy," by Tommy McRae, age 5. Jesse stared at that drawing until his vision blurred. This was how his son had seen him, had needed to see him. Not as the broken, violent man who had fled in shame, but as some kind of hero, a cowboy. Someone strong and brave and worth waiting for. The weight of that faith, that innocent trust, was almost unbearable. Tommy had been 5 years old when he drew this picture, carefully signing his name, creating an image of a father he barely knew or perhaps didn't know at all. And that father had been sleeping under bridges and drinking in dive bars, never once thinking to come home. Jesse folded the drawings carefully and added them to the cedar box with the letters. Then he made a decision. He needed to know more. He needed to understand what had happened to Sarah and Tommy after they'd left this place. And that meant going into town. The walk to Redemption Creek took Jesse nearly 3 hours. He followed the highway, staying off to the side in the grass when the occasional vehicle passed. The spring morning was clear and cool, and despite the turmoil in his mind, Jesse found himself noticing the beauty of the country around him, the way the sunlight caught the new leaves on the cottonwoods, the songs of birds he couldn't name, the vast openness of the sky. Redemption Creek announced itself gradually. First came the scattered houses on the outskirts, then a gas station, then the main street with its handful of businesses. The town had the weathered, stubborn look of small communities across Montana, places that had survived because the people who lived in them were too determined or too rooted to leave. Jesse walked slowly down Main Street, noting the bank, the post office, a diner called the Prairie Rose, a hardware store, and near the end of the street, a general store with Hartwell's painted on the window in faded gold letters. An old bell jangled above the door as Jesse entered. The store smelled of floor wax and coffee and something else, cinnamon maybe or vanilla. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from canned goods to work gloves to magazines. A checkout counter stood to the left, and behind it sat a woman who looked to be in her 70s. Her white hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp and assessing behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Help you find something?" Her voice was neither friendly nor unfriendly, simply businesslike. "Just looking for some supplies," Jesse said quietly. "Soap, maybe some beans and bread if you have it." The woman nodded. "Aisle 2 for the soap, aisle 3 for food." "Take your time." Jesse gathered the items quickly. A bar of soap, 3 cans of beans, a loaf of bread, some coffee. As he brought them to the counter, he realized he had no money. His last $15 had gone to the ranch, and he had nothing else. "I need to tell you something," he said, the words difficult. "I don't have money to pay for this right now. I was hoping—" "You're the one who bought the old McRae place." It wasn't a question. Jesse met her eyes, surprised. "How did you—" "Small town. Word travels." She began ringing up his items. "Eleanor Hartwell. I own this place. Jesse." He hesitated, then added, "McRae." Eleanor's hands paused on the cash register keys. She looked at him more closely, her eyes traveling over his weathered face, his long hair and beard, his worn clothes. Something in her expression shifted. "McRae," she repeated softly. "I should have seen it. You have your father's eyes. And there's something of Jesse in you, too, though time hasn't been kind. You knew—" Jesse stopped, his heart pounding. "You knew my father. Knew the whole family." Eleanor resumed ringing up the items. "Your father Tom worked hard on that land. Your mother passed when you were young. I remember that. And I remember Sarah, sweet girl, who married Tom's boy. And little Tommy before they moved away." She looked at him directly. "Where have you been, Jesse McRae?" "It's been more than 40 years. The question held no judgment, only curiosity and perhaps a trace of concern. Jesse found he couldn't answer. His throat had closed up, and he didn't trust himself to speak. Eleanor seemed to understand. She totaled the items and wrote the amount on a small pad of paper. "You can pay me when you're able. You're a McRae. We take care of our own here, even the ones who've been gone too long." Jesse nodded, not trusting his voice. He gathered his supplies into the worn canvas bag Eleanor provided. "Sarah was a good woman," Eleanor said as he turned to leave. "Waited as long as she could. Nobody blamed her when she finally moved on. Is she—" Jesse forced the words out. "Is she still alive? Do you know where she went?" Eleanor's expression gentled with sympathy. "Sarah passed 5 years back, Jesse. Cancer. She came back to Redemption Creek toward the end, wanted to be buried here. She's in the cemetery behind the Methodist church." She paused. "Tommy came to the funeral. He's a reverend now up in Billings, I think. Or maybe Missoula. Good man from what I heard." Jesse stood frozen, the bag of supplies hanging from his hand. Sarah was dead. She'd waited years for him, then moved on with her life, and now she was gone. Another door closed, another chance lost forever. "Thank you," he managed to say, and walked out into the bright morning sunlight that suddenly felt too harsh, too revealing. The walk back to the ranch passed in a blur. Jesse moved mechanically, one foot in front of the other, his mind churning through what he'd learned. Sarah was dead. Tommy was alive, a reverend somewhere. The town remembered the McRae family, remembered what Jesse had walked away from. When he reached the ranch, Jesse set his supplies on the kitchen counter and walked back out to sit on the porch steps. He stayed there as the afternoon sun tracked across the sky, thinking about the woman who had loved him, about the son who had drawn pictures of a father he barely knew, about the 40 years he'd wasted running from ghosts. As evening approached, Jesse made himself a simple meal and ate it without tasting it. Then he retrieved the cedar box from beneath the floorboard and sat with it on the porch, reading Sarah's letters again in the fading light, memorizing the shape of her words, the cadence of her voice that came through in the handwriting. He couldn't bring Sarah back. He couldn't give Tommy back the father he'd needed as a child. But maybe, Jesse thought as darkness settled over the prairie, maybe he could start by honoring their memory. Maybe he could rebuild what they'd tried to maintain. Maybe he could make this broken place whole again, even if he could never make himself whole. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was something to work toward, some purpose beyond simply surviving another day. And for Jesse McRae, sitting on the porch of the home he'd abandoned 40 years ago, it was a beginning. 3 days passed before Jesse found the photograph. He spent those days working on the ranch with a kind of quiet intensity, repairing what could be repaired, clearing away years of accumulated debris, making the place look less like a ruin and more like a home someone might actually inhabit. The work felt good. His muscles ached in ways they hadn't in years, the honest ache of physical labor, rather than the dull pain of sleeping on concrete or the sharp protests of an aging body pushed too far. He fell asleep each night exhausted and woke each morning with purpose. The photograph revealed itself in an unlikely place, the back of a kitchen drawer that Jesse had been trying to pry loose to repair the runners. The drawer had become stuck at some point over the years, and Jesse was using a screwdriver to work it free when he felt something shift behind it. When he finally got the drawer out completely, he found a small object had fallen behind it and lodged against the back of the cabinet. It was a photograph in a broken frame. The glass shattered long ago, the cardboard backing water-stained and warped. Jesse pulled it free carefully and brushed away the dust and cobwebs. The photograph showed a young man and a young woman standing in front of this very house. The man wore a military dress uniform, his hair cut short, his shoulders square. The woman wore a simple white dress, her dark hair falling past her shoulders, her smile bright and hopeful. They stood close together, the man's arm around the woman's waist, both of them looking at the camera as if the whole world belonged to them. Jesse stared at the photograph for a long time before accepting what he was seeing. The young man was himself, though he barely recognized that version of Jesse McRae. 23 years old, fresh back from his second tour, still believing he could leave the war behind and build a normal life. still believing he deserved happiness, and the woman was Sarah. Beautiful Sarah, with her kind eyes and gentle smile, looking at the camera like she held all the love in the world in her heart. Jesse turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting he now knew as well as his own, Sarah had written, "Before everything changed, before you left." June 1981, June 1981. Jesse closed his eyes and let the memories come, really come, for the first time in decades. He'd been pushing them away, keeping them at bay. But the photograph made that impossible. He remembered coming home from Vietnam the first time in 1973, barely 20 years old, and already carrying darkness he couldn't name. He'd done his time, got out, tried to find work, but the darkness followed him. The nightmares, the sudden rages, the drinking that was supposed to help, but never did. He drifted for a while, working construction jobs and ranch work, moving from town to town, running from himself. Then he'd re-enlisted, because the military made sense in a way civilian life didn't. At least in the service, the violence had purpose. At least there the darkness was expected, even valued. He'd done another tour, come back in 1980 with more ghosts than before, and somehow, miraculously, he'd ended up in Redemption Creek, working for his father on the ranch he'd inherited from Jesse's grandfather. And there was Sarah working at the diner in town, and she'd looked at him like he was worth looking at, like he was someone who could be saved. They'd married quickly, maybe too quickly, but it had felt right. Sarah was patient with his silences, gentle with his moods. She saw the man he wanted to be, rather than the man the war had made him. For a while, Jesse had believed he could be that man. The memory sharpened, became more painful. He remembered the night everything fell apart. He'd been drinking. He was always drinking in those days, and something had triggered a flashback. A car backfiring on the highway, maybe, or a door slamming. Something that sounded too much like gunfire. And suddenly he wasn't in Montana anymore. He was back in the jungle, and Sarah was the enemy, and his hands were around her throat before he even knew what he was doing. She'd screamed, and the sound had snapped him back to reality. He'd let go immediately, horrified, stumbling backward. Sarah had stood there, terrified, holding her throat where his fingerprints were already forming bruises. And in her eyes, Jesse had seen something that broke him completely. She was scared of him. The person she loved most in the world terrified her. "You need to go," she'd said, her voice hoarse. "Jesse, you need to go before you hurt me worse. Before you hurt the baby." Baby. She was 3 months pregnant, though they hadn't told anyone yet. And he'd almost killed her, almost killed them both. Jesse had left that night with nothing but the clothes on his back and the shame that would follow him for the rest of his life. He'd told himself he was protecting her, that staying away was the right thing to do. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He was a coward, too broken to get help, too ashamed to try, too afraid of what he might do if he stayed. He drifted after that, disappearing into the kind of life where names didn't matter and pasts could be forgotten. He'd worked when he could, drank when he couldn't, slept wherever he ended up. The years blurred together into a long grey stretch of not quite living. And all the while, Sarah had been here waiting for him, raising their son, keeping the ranch going until she couldn't anymore. Jesse set the photograph down carefully on the kitchen counter and walked outside. He needed air, needed space, needed to see the horizon so he wouldn't feel like the walls were closing in. He was standing by the old barn, staring at nothing, when he heard the sound of an engine approaching. A pickup truck, older model, well used, pulled up the driveway and stopped near the house. A young man climbed out, tall and lean, probably not yet 20. He wore work jeans and a flannel shirt, a cap shading his face. "Afternoon," the young man called out, walking toward Jesse with an easy, respectful stride. "Name's Marcus Webb. I work at the Larson Ranch down the road." "So you were doing some fixing up here?" Jesse nodded but didn't speak, waiting to see what the kid wanted. Marcus gestured toward the fence line. "I noticed some of your fence posts are down. They run up against our property line, and Mr. Larson asked me to check if you needed any help with repairs. Good fences make good neighbors and all that. "I can handle it," Jesse said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm sure you can," Marcus agreed easily. "But an extra pair of hands makes the work go faster. I've got tomorrow afternoon free if you want help setting those posts." No charge, just neighborly. Jesse studied the young man more carefully. There was something genuine in his expression. None of the pity or judgment Jesse had grown used to seeing in people's eyes when they looked at him. Just straightforward honesty and a willingness to help. "Why?" Jesse asked. It was the question he always asked when people offered kindness. He'd learned to be suspicious of generosity, to look for the angle, the expectation of something in return. Marcus shrugged. "My grandmother raised me after my folks took off. She taught me that when you've got two working hands and a neighbor who needs help, you help. That's all." There was something in those words, the casual mention of parents who had left, that resonated with Jesse in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. He found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to accept the offer. "Tomorrow afternoon, then," Jesse said. Marcus smiled. "I'll bring the post-hole digger and some extra wire. You got coffee?" "I do now." "Good enough." Marcus headed back to his truck, then paused and turned back. "This place has good bones, Mr. Jesse, just Jesse then. This place has good bones. It'll be something fine when you're done with it." After Marcus drove away, Jesse returned to the kitchen and picked up the photograph again. He looked at the young couple staring back at him, so full of hope and possibility, and felt the weight of 40 lost years pressing down on his shoulders. But he also felt something else, something new and fragile. Marcus would come tomorrow to help with the fences. Eleanor had offered him credit at the store. The town remembered his family, remembered him even after all this time. Maybe it was too late to reclaim what he'd lost. Sarah was gone. Tommy had grown up without him, and probably neither needed nor wanted a father who appeared out of nowhere after 4 decades. But maybe it wasn't too late to honor their memory by making something of the place they'd tried to build together. Jesse placed the photograph on the mantel above the fireplace, the first decoration in the empty house. The glass was broken and the frame was damaged, but the image remained clear. 2 young people before the world broke them, before everything changed, before he left. He couldn't go back to that moment, couldn't undo the choices he'd made or unmake the man he'd become. But maybe, with work and time and the help of people like Marcus, who still believed in the simple act of being neighborly, he could build something here that would last. Something that would prove he'd been worth Sarah's love, worth Tommy's faith, worth the second chance that had brought him back to this land. It wouldn't be redemption. Not yet, but it would be a start. Marcus returned the next afternoon as promised, and in the days that followed, he came back again and again. The young man worked with a steady, uncomplaining rhythm that reminded Jesse of soldiers he'd known, people who understood that some jobs required persistence more than brilliance, that showing up was half the battle. Together, they reset fence posts, restrung wire, patched holes in the barn roof. Marcus didn't talk much while they worked, and Jesse appreciated that. When conversation did happen, it was practical. "Pass me that hammer. Hold this steady. We'll need more wire for the south section." The silence between words was comfortable, not awkward. 2 weeks into their partnership, Jesse was alone in the house, cleaning out the bedroom closet more thoroughly than he had before. He'd already removed the clothes hangers and the single child's shoe. Now he was pulling out boxes from the upper shelf, most of them empty or containing nothing but dust and mouse droppings. The last box, pushed far back into the corner, was different. Jesse pulled it down and found it surprisingly heavy. Inside, wrapped in an old towel, was a leather journal, its cover worn soft with handling, its pages thick with writing. Jesse carried it to the window and opened it carefully. The first page bore an inscription in Sarah's handwriting. "My journal. Started January 1982. For my own eyes only, but if Jesse ever comes home, I hope he reads every word and understands." Jesse turned the page and began to read. The entries started shortly after Tommy's birth. Brief notes about the daily routines of new motherhood. "Tommy slept 4 hours straight last night, a record. I actually slept too. Feel almost human this morning. Then took Tommy to the doctor in town. He's healthy and growing. Dr. Morrison said I'm doing a good job, but I feel like I'm drowning most days. As Jesse read through the months, he watched Sarah's life unfold in her own words. The journal chronicled not just Tommy's development, but Sarah's own struggles and small triumphs. She wrote about working at the diner, about the townspeople who helped her, about the loneliness that crept in during the quiet hours after Tommy was asleep. Sometimes I forget what Jesse's voice sounded like, she wrote in August 1982. I can see his face in my memory, but the sound of him is fading. It scares me to think that someday Tommy won't remember his father at all, and I won't be able to describe him accurately. How do you explain someone's essence to a child who never really knew them? Jesse read about the ranch work Sarah struggled to maintain, fences that needed mending, equipment she couldn't operate alone, decisions she didn't feel qualified to make. Tom McRae's son should be here running this place, she wrote. But Tom McRae's son is wherever broken men go when they can't face their families. The entries revealed financial struggles, missed payments, and small acts of kindness from neighbors. They showed Sarah's pride and her reluctance to accept charity, even when she desperately needed it. They showed her slowly coming to terms with the reality that Jesse wasn't coming back. Jesse was deep in the journal, reading an entry from 1985, when he heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. He set the journal aside and went to the porch, expecting Marcus. Instead, an old Ford pickup, even more weathered than Marcus's, pulled up, and an elderly man climbed out with the careful movements of someone whose joints didn't bend quite as freely as they once had. The man was tall, probably close to 6.5 feet in his youth, though age had stooped him some. He wore jeans, a work shirt, and a hat that had seen better decades. His face was deeply lined, weathered by years of outdoor work, and his eyes were the pale blue-gray of old denim. He stood looking at Jesse for a long moment, those eyes taking in every detail. "I'll be damned," the old man finally said, his voice gravelly. "It is you. Heard a McRae was back at the old place. Had to see for myself if it was Jesse." Jesse felt his chest tighten. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "Curtis Brennan. Most folks call me Kurt." The old man walked forward, his gait steady despite his age. "I knew your father. Worked horses with him for near about 30 years. And I knew you when you were just a pup, before you went off to the service." Memories stirred, vague and distant. Jesse did remember an old cowboy who worked with his father, teaching a young Jesse to ride, to gentle a horse, to read the weather in the clouds. But that memory belonged to a different lifetime. "Mr. Brennan," Jesse said carefully. "That was a long time ago." Kurt, and yes, it was. The old man reached the porch and studied Jesse's face with an intensity that made Jesse want to look away. 40-some years, give or take. You were about 20 when you left. I was there that night, you know. Your father called me over after you'd gone, asked me to help him look for you. We searched for 2 days before we figured out you'd left the state entirely." Jesse's hands clenched at his sides. He didn't want to talk about that night. Didn't want to hear what his father had thought or said about his leaving. Kurt seemed to sense his discomfort. "I'm not here to judge you, son. I'm 71 years old. I've seen too much of life to judge any man for his choices, especially choices made when he was hurting." He gestured toward the porch steps. "Mind if I sit? My knees aren't what they used to be." "Go ahead." Kurt lowered himself onto the steps with a grunt of relief. Jesse remained standing, uncomfortable with the conversation, but unable to make himself walk away from it. "Your father died in 1990, Kurt said after a moment. "Heart attack while he was working on the fence line. Went quick, which is how he would have wanted it. He left the ranch to you in his will. Lawyer tried to find you for months, but you disappeared pretty thoroughly." Jesse felt the words like blows. His father had died, and Jesse hadn't known. The ranch had been left to him, and he'd never claimed it. It had sat empty and abandoned, eventually going to auction for unpaid taxes, where Jesse had bought it back without even knowing it was his to begin with. "Sarah tried to keep it going after your father passed," Kurt continued. "She was working herself to the bone between the diner and the ranch. I helped when I could, but I was running my own place back then. She finally had to let it go. Broke her heart to leave, but she couldn't do it alone. He paused, then added quietly, "No woman should have to." "I know about Sarah," Jesse said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor told me she passed 5 years back," Kurt confirmed. "Cancer. She came back here at the end. Said she wanted to be buried in Redemption Creek near your parents. I visited her in the hospital a few times before she went. She talked about you sometimes." He looked up at Jesse. "Never with anger." "That surprised me. Just sadness. She said she understood why you left. Said she never blamed you for it." Jesse had to sit down. He lowered himself onto the porch beside Kurt, his legs suddenly unable to hold him. "I should have come back," he said. "I should have gotten help. Should have been here for her, for my son, for my father. I ran because I was scared and broken, and I let that fear destroy everything." "Yes," Kurt agreed simply. "You should have. And you didn't, and that's something you're going to have to live with." He turned to look at Jesse directly. "But running don't fix what's broken, son. Just makes the distance longer. You ran for 40 years and now you're back. Question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Jesse shook his head. "There's nothing to do about it. Sarah's dead. My father's dead. My son grew up without me. I can't fix any of that." "No, you can't," Kurt said. "Can't go back and change what was. But you can honor what they built, what they tried to give you. You can take this land that 3 generations of McRae's worked and make it into something again. You can stop running and start building." He pushed himself to his feet with a grunt. "That's why I came out here. To see if you were back for real or just passing through. To see if Tom McRae's boy finally came home. I don't know what I'm doing here," Jesse admitted. "I spent my last $15 on this place without even knowing it was mine. I've got nothing to my name except some tools and the clothes on my back. But you've got this land," Kurt said, "and you've got hands that know how to work. And you've got at least one neighbor, that Webb boy, who's willing to help. That's more than a lot of men start with." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, faded and worn. "This is where you can reach me. I'm too old to do the heavy work anymore, but I still know horses, and I still know this country. You need advice or help, you call me." Jesse took the card, feeling the weight of the gesture. "Why would you help me? After everything? Because your father was a good man, and Sarah was a good woman, and they both believed you were worth believing in despite everything." Kurt walked toward his truck, then turned back. "And because I'm old enough to know that sometimes the longest journey a man can make is the one back to himself. If you're finally ready to make that journey, you're going to need people who remember who you were supposed to be." Jesse watched the old man drive away, then sat on the porch as the afternoon sun tracked across the sky. He thought about his father, who he barely remembered. Thought about Sarah, who had kept this place running until she couldn't anymore. Thought about the 40 years he'd wasted, the chances he'd thrown away, the people who had loved him despite his failings. When Marcus arrived later that afternoon, Jesse was still sitting there, Sarah's journal open in his lap, reading about the life he'd missed while he was busy running from himself. "You all right?" Marcus asked, climbing out of his truck. Jesse looked up at the young man who had shown up day after day to help a stranger rebuild a broken-down ranch. "No," he said honestly. "But I'm working on it." Marcus nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. "Good enough. You want to help me with that barn door? I think we can get it hung straight if we work together." Together. That word felt foreign and familiar all at once. Jesse closed the journal, set it carefully aside, and stood up. "Let's get to it," he said, and followed Marcus out to the barn. Grateful for the work, grateful for the company, grateful for the small mercy of hands that remembered how to build, even when the heart was still learning how to heal. Kurt became a regular presence at the ranch over the following weeks. He couldn't do the heavy lifting anymore. His back and knees wouldn't allow it, but his knowledge proved invaluable. He knew which fence posts would hold and which needed replacing, where water tended to collect and cause problems. How to read the land in ways that only came from decades of experience. The 3 men, Jesse, Marcus, and Kurt, fell into an easy rhythm. Marcus provided the muscle and enthusiasm of youth. Kurt provided the wisdom and patience of age. And Jesse, caught between them, provided the desperate need for purpose that drove them all forward. The ranch transformed slowly but visibly. The main fence line was restored. The barn, while still lacking part of its roof, was stabilized and usable. The house looked less like a ruin and more like a home. Its windows cleaned, its porch rebuilt. Its door hanging straight on new hinges. It was while cleaning out the attic space above the bedroom, a cramped area Jesse had been avoiding, that he found the box. It was military green, the kind of footlocker issued to soldiers for storing personal effects. Jesse had to crawl on his belly through dust and insulation to reach it, dragging it back to the access panel with difficulty. He carried the footlocker down to the living room and set it on the floor. His hands hesitated on the latches. He knew without opening it what he would find inside, the parts of himself he'd left behind when he ran. The latches released with rusty clicks. Inside, wrapped in an old uniform shirt, were his military papers, his dog tags on their chain, and a small velvet box that could only contain one thing. Jesse picked up the box and opened it. The Purple Heart gleamed against its silk lining, the medal awarded for wounds received in combat. Jesse had earned it during his second tour, though he'd never felt like he deserved it. So many men had been hurt worse, had died. What was a piece of shrapnel in the shoulder compared to that? Beneath the medal box, he found an envelope, yellowed with age. His name was written on it in his own handwriting, and below that, for Sarah. Jesse opened the envelope with trembling fingers and pulled out the letter inside. It was dated March 1980, written shortly before he'd come home from his final tour. "Dear Sarah," it began, "by the time you read this, I'll be home. I'm writing this letter now because I want to remember what I'm thinking and feeling in this moment before I get back to the world and everything gets complicated again. I want to remember that I promised myself I'd be different this time. Better, the man you deserve. I've seen things here that I can't talk about, done things that wake me up at night. But I'm going to leave all that over here when I come home. I'm going to be the man I was before the war. Or if I can't be him, I'm going to be someone even better. I'm going to work hard on the ranch with my father. I'm going to take care of you the way you deserve. I'm going to build us a life that matters. This war has taken enough from me. It doesn't get to take my future. I love you. I'll see you soon, Jesse." He read the letter 3 times, each reading more painful than the last. The promise had been sincere. He remembered writing it, remembered believing every word. He genuinely thought he could leave the war behind, compartmentalize it, lock it away, and get on with living. But war didn't work that way. The things he'd seen, the things he'd done, they'd come home with him whether he wanted them to or not. They lived in his nightmares, in his sudden rages, in his inability to feel safe even in the safest places. Jesse closed his eyes and let the memories come fully, no longer trying to push them away. He remembered the jungle, the heat and humidity that made everything rot, including men's souls. He remembered the sound of artillery, the way it made your chest vibrate even from miles away. He remembered the faces of men he'd known, men who had been alive one moment and gone the next. He remembered the village where things had gone wrong, where the intelligence had been bad, where they'd been told they were engaging enemy combatants but found women and children instead. He remembered the screaming, the confusion, the blood that looked black in the darkness. He remembered the weight of understanding that some mistakes could never be unmade, some actions could never be forgiven. That's what he'd brought home with him. Not just the flashbacks and the nightmares, but the bone-deep certainty that he was capable of terrible things, that inside him lived something dark and violent, something the war had awakened but not created. And that certainty had made him dangerous, especially when alcohol quieted the fear but amplified the rage. The afternoon was waning when Kurt found Jesse sitting on the porch, the Purple Heart in one hand and the letter in the other. The old man lowered himself onto the steps without asking permission or offering commentary. He just sat there, present and patient. "I read the letter I wrote to Sarah before I came home," Jesse finally said. "I promised her I'd be better. Promised I'd leave the war behind." He laughed bitterly. "I couldn't even manage that for 6 months before I put my hands on her." Kurt was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. "What happened to you over there, Jesse?" "What happens to any soldier? Too much, too young, too fast. Did you talk to anyone about it? Counseling, therapy, anything like that?" Jesse shook his head. "Wasn't really done back then. You just dealt with it. Men didn't talk about feelings or trauma. You stuffed it down and moved on. Except you couldn't move on," Kurt said gently. "None of you could. I saw it in plenty of boys who came back from that war. They'd be jumpy, angry, drinking too much. Some of them got mean. Some of them got quiet and never quite came back all the way. We didn't have a name for it then, but we knew something was wrong with how they sent you boys over there and then just expected you to come home and be normal. PTSD, Jesse said. That's what they call it now. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Sounds so clinical, so manageable, like it's something that can be fixed with the right pills or the right therapy. Maybe it can be, Kurt said. Maybe if you'd had help back then, things would have turned out different. But you didn't get help, and things turned out how they did. Question is, are you going to get help now? Jesse looked at the old man. I'm 63 years old. I've been broken for longer than some people live. What's the point of getting help now? The point is you're still breathing, Kurt said firmly. You're still here, still capable of making different choices. You can't fix the past, but you don't have to let it write your future. He gestured toward the ranch. Look what you've done here in just a few weeks. This place was dead, and you're bringing it back to life. If you can do that with land and wood, maybe you can do it with yourself too. Jesse wanted to believe that. Wanted to think redemption was possible even at his age, even with his history. But the weight of 40 years pressed down on him, all those wasted days, all those people he'd hurt or abandoned. Sarah's gone, he said. I can never apologize to her, can never explain or make it right. No, you can't, Kurt agreed. But you can honor her memory. She kept this place going as long as she could because she believed in what it represented. She believed in you, Jesse, even when you didn't believe in yourself. The best apology you can offer her now is to finally become the man she always knew you could be. They sat in silence as the sun set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Marcus arrived shortly after, and the three of them shared a simple dinner Jesse had prepared, beans and cornbread and coffee, strong enough to strip paint. They didn't talk much, but the silence was companionable, comfortable. Later that night, after the others had left, Jesse placed the purple heart and the letter on the mantel beside the photograph of himself and Sarah. 3 artifacts from a life he'd tried to forget, now displayed where he'd see them every day. Reminders of who he'd been, what he'd lost, and what he still might become. He thought about what Kurt had said about getting help, about therapy. The idea felt strange, uncomfortable. But maybe strange and uncomfortable was where growth happened. Maybe admitting you needed help was the first step toward deserving it. The next Sunday, Jesse walked into town for the church service. He'd been avoiding it, uncomfortable with the idea of sitting among people who might remember him, might judge him. But Kurt had mentioned that the church community had helped Sarah when she was struggling, and Jesse wanted to see the place that had been good to his family when he hadn't been. The Methodist church was small and white, its steeple pointing toward the endless Montana sky. Jesse slipped in just as the service was starting and took a seat in the back pew. The congregation was small, maybe 40 people, mostly older folks with a scattering of families. The Reverend was younger than Jesse expected, probably in his early 50s, with kind eyes and an easy manner. He spoke about forgiveness and second chances, about how it was never too late to turn toward home. Jesse wondered if someone had told him about the prodigal son who'd returned to the McRae ranch, or if the timing was just coincidence. After the service, people mingled outside, and Jesse tried to slip away unnoticed. But Eleanor Hartwell spotted him and waved him over to where she stood with a group of elderly women. Ladies, this is Jesse McRae, she said with a pointed look that dared any of them to be unkind. He's fixing up the old McRae place. The women nodded politely, and Jesse endured several minutes of questions about the ranch before excusing himself. As he walked away, he heard one of them whisper, "That's the one who left Sarah," and another reply, "Hush, people can change." Could they? Jesse wasn't sure. But as he walked back toward the ranch, feeling the spring sun on his face and the honest tiredness in his muscles from weeks of hard work, he thought maybe Kurt was right. Maybe you couldn't fix the past, but you could choose who you wanted to be going forward. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The knowledge that Sarah was dead, that he could never apologize or explain or seek her forgiveness, ate at Jesse like acid. He'd been carrying the hope, however small, that maybe he could find her, tell her he was sorry, show her that he'd finally come home. But that door was closed forever, sealed by 5 years of dirt and grass and the finality of death. For 3 days after learning of Sarah's passing, Jesse barely left the house. He went through the motions, pumping water, eating because his body required it, sleeping fitfully, but his heart wasn't in any of it. Marcus came by and found him sitting on the porch, staring at nothing. "You want help with anything today?" Marcus asked. "No," Jesse said. "Maybe tomorrow." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded and left without pressing. Kurt stopped by the next day and received the same response. The old man lingered longer, his eyes worried, but he too respected Jesse's need for solitude. On the 4th day, Jesse woke with the familiar weight of despair pressing down on his chest. It was the same feeling that had driven him from town to town, bottle to bottle, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or form connections. The same feeling that had kept him on the move for 4 decades. He could leave. The thought came clearly, simply. He could walk away from this place just like he'd walked away before. Marcus and Kurt would understand, or if they didn't, it wouldn't matter. He'd be gone. He could hitchhike back to wherever the road took him, disappear back into that anonymous life where the past didn't matter because there was no future. Jesse stood in the living room of the house, his duffel bag in hand, ready to pack his few possessions. He looked around at the space he'd been cleaning and repairing, at the photograph on the mantel, the purple heart beside it, the letter to Sarah, at the floorboard that hid the cedar box with its bundle of letters and child's drawings. What was the point of staying? Sarah was dead. Tommy was 42 years old, a man with his own life, probably his own family. Jesse was just an old ghost, haunting a place that had moved on without him. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the weeks of work he'd already invested. Maybe it was Sarah's voice in his memory, or the way Kurt had looked at him and said, "Running don't fix what's broken, son." Jesse set down the duffel bag and returned to the bedroom. If he was going to leave, he needed to be sure there was nothing left to find, no more surprises waiting to ambush him. He'd search the house one final time, and then he'd decide. He started with the closet, pulling out everything that remained, checking every corner. He moved to the dresser drawers, most of which were empty. Then he knelt and checked under the bedframe, finding nothing but dust. The nightstand drawer stuck when he tried to open it. Jesse worked it carefully, and when it finally came free, he found it packed with papers, old bills, receipts, a few greeting cards. He was about to dismiss it as unimportant when he noticed an envelope tucked into the back corner, different from the others. It was larger, official-looking, with a legal firm's name embossed in the corner. Jesse pulled it out and found it unsealed. Inside were legal documents, adoption papers. He read through them slowly, his hands beginning to shake. Thomas Michael McRae, age 12, hereby adopted by Thomas Whitfield Sr. and Martha Whitfield of Redemption Creek, Montana. Date, June 15th, 1993. Tommy had been adopted by Reverend Whitfield and his wife. Jesse read the names again, then a third time, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Whitfield, the Reverend at the Methodist Church, the man who had spoken about forgiveness and second chances, who had kind eyes and an easy manner. That was Tommy, his son, the boy who had drawn pictures of cowboys and waited for a father who never came home, had grown up to be Reverend Thomas Whitfield. Jesse sat down hard on the floor, the papers scattered around him. He'd been in the same room as his son, had listened to him preach, had shaken his hand after the service, had heard his voice and looked into his face without recognizing him. His own son, but of course he hadn't recognized him. Jesse had left when Tommy was 3 months old. He had no idea what the baby had grown up to look like. And Tommy had been adopted, had taken his adoptive parents' name, had built a life that had nothing to do with Jesse McRae. With shaking hands, Jesse gathered up the papers and noticed something else in the envelope, a letter sealed in a separate, smaller envelope. Written on the front in Sarah's handwriting, "Jesse McRae, if you ever come back." Jesse broke the seal and unfolded the letter. It was dated December 2019, less than 6 months before Sarah died. "Jesse, if you're reading this, then you finally came home. I don't know if that makes me happy or sad, probably both. I'm writing this from the hospital where I'm being treated for cancer. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months, maybe less. I've made my peace with dying. I've had a good life despite everything, but I need you to know some things before I go. Tommy was adopted by Thomas and Martha Whitfield when he was 12. They're good people, Jesse. They gave him stability and love and a home I couldn't provide on my own. They raised him in the church, and he grew up to follow in Thomas's footsteps. He became a reverend himself, and he's a good man. Kind, patient, genuinely faithful. He has your eyes and your stubbornness, but he has my heart, and for that I'm grateful. Here's the hard part. Tommy doesn't know the whole truth about you. I told him his father was sick, that you had demons from the war that you couldn't overcome. I told him you left to protect us, which is true, even if it's not the whole truth. He doesn't know about that night, about your hands on my throat, about the fear. I didn't want him to carry that. Thomas and Martha know. They needed to know what they were taking on, but Tommy only knows that his birth father loved him but couldn't stay. I forgave you a long time ago, Jesse. I understood why you left, even if it broke my heart. But Tommy has had a good life without you. He's happy, settled, respected in the community. If you come back and find this letter, I'm asking you to think carefully before you reveal yourself to him. He deserves to know who his father is, but he also deserves peace. Don't disrupt his life unless you're certain you can be a part of it in a positive way. Don't show up just to ease your own guilt and then disappear again. If you're back for good, if you're ready to stay and be the man I always believed you could be, then yes, tell him. Let him decide if he wants a relationship with you. But if you're just passing through, if you're still running, then let him be. Let him have the peace he's earned. I loved you, Jesse. Part of me always will. I hope you found whatever you were looking for out there. I hope it was worth the cost. And I hope, if you're reading this, that you finally found your way home. With love and forgiveness, Sarah. Jesse read the letter twice, then a third time. Sarah had forgiven him. She'd understood. And she'd protected Tommy even in death, leaving these words to guide Jesse toward the right choice. Tommy was the Reverend, the man who spoke about forgiveness and second chances every Sunday, who had shaken Jesse's hand with genuine warmth, who had no idea he was standing 3 feet from his biological father. Jesse's first instinct was to run, to pack his bag and disappear before the situation could get more complicated. But Sarah's words stopped him. If you're back for good, if you're ready to stay and be the man I always believed you could be, then yes, tell him. Was he back for good? Jesse looked around the bedroom, at the work he'd done, the life he was slowly rebuilding. He thought about Marcus showing up day after day to help a stranger, about Kurt offering wisdom and patience, about Eleanor extending credit at the store because the McRae name still meant something in this town. He thought about the photograph on the mantel, about Sarah's letters hidden in the floor, about Tommy's drawings of a father he'd never really known, about 40 years of running that had led him right back to this place, to this moment. Jesse stood up, carefully folding Sarah's letter and placing it with the adoption papers. He walked to the living room and looked at his duffel bag, still sitting where he'd left it, waiting to be packed. Then he looked at the photograph of himself and Sarah, young and hopeful and whole. He couldn't run anymore, couldn't leave again. Not because it would be wrong, though it would be, but because he was tired. Bone deep, soul-weary, tired of running. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stand still and face what he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. But how did you tell a man in his 40s that his homeless, broken-down father had been sitting in his congregation for the past month? How did you explain 40 years of absence? How did you ask for forgiveness from someone who didn't even know they needed to give it? Jesse had no answers, but he knew he needed help figuring it out. He walked outside to where his ancient truck, purchased with a loan from Eleanor that he still hadn't figured out how to repay, sat in the driveway. He drove to Kurt's place and found the old man in his workshop mending a bridle. "I need to tell you something," Jesse said, and for the next hour he laid out everything he'd discovered. The letters, the adoption papers, Sarah's final message, the stunning realization that his son was the town reverend. Kurt listened without interrupting, his weathered face thoughtful. When Jesse finished, the old man was quiet for a long moment. "Well," Kurt finally said, "that's a complication. What do I do?" "You tell him the truth," Kurt said simply. "But you do it right. You don't ambush him at church or show up at his house unannounced. You ask him to come to the ranch. You show him what you've been doing, let him see that you're serious about staying. And then you tell him who you are and let him decide what he wants to do with that information. What if he hates me? What if he tells me to leave and never come back? Then you respect his wishes," Kurt said. "But Jesse, from what you've told me about Sarah's letter, she raised that boy to understand forgiveness. She gave him the tools to handle this, even if she didn't know when or how it would happen. Give him a chance. Give yourself a chance." Jesse drove back to the ranch with Kurt's words echoing in his mind. When he got home, he unpacked his duffel bag and put his clothes back in the dresser drawer. He wasn't running. Not this time. He was going to stay, and he was going to tell his son the truth. And whatever happened after that would happen. But first, he needed to make sure the ranch was something worth coming home to. Jesse became a regular at Sunday services. He sat in the same back pew each week, listening to Tommy preach, watching the way his son moved and spoke and interacted with his congregation. Each week brought new observations, new recognitions of familiar traits. Tommy had Sarah's gentle manner, the way she'd had of making people feel heard and valued. But he had Jesse's height, his broad shoulders, the set of his jaw. When Tommy smiled, Jesse saw his own father's smile, passed down through generations. When Tommy's brow furrowed in concentration during his sermons, Jesse recognized the expression from photographs of himself at that age. The congregation loved him. That much was clear. After services, people clustered around Tommy, seeking advice, sharing news, asking for prayers. He gave each person his full attention, never rushed, never dismissive. Jesse watched from a distance, staying on the periphery, and felt a mixture of pride and grief so intense it was hard to breathe. This was his son. This good, kind, faithful man was his son, and Jesse had missed every moment of his becoming. One Sunday after the service, Jesse helped stack chairs in the church hall. Tommy worked alongside the volunteers, and at one point he ended up next to Jesse, both of them carrying a stack of hymnals to the storage closet. "Jesse, isn't it?" Tommy asked, his voice warm. "You've been coming for a few weeks now. Are you settling in at the old McRae place?" "Trying to," Jesse managed, his throat tight. Up close, Tommy's eyes were unmistakably his own, that same pale blue-gray. "It's a lot of work. I'm sure it is. That place has been empty for years." Tommy set down the hymnals and extended his hand. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Thomas Whitfield. Most folks call me Tom or Reverend Tom." Jesse shook his son's hand, feeling the calluses there. Tommy did physical work, not just pastoral work. "Jesse McRae," he said, the words feeling like a confession even though Tommy didn't know their significance. "McRae," Tommy repeated thoughtfully. "Same name as the ranch. Are you related to the family that used to own it?" "Distantly," Jesse lied, hating himself for it even as the words left his mouth. "Very distantly." They worked together for another hour, clearing the hall after a church lunch. Tommy talked easily about the community, about the families who attended, about the challenges of maintaining an old church building on a limited budget. Jesse listened and responded when appropriate, treasuring every moment of conversation, even as his heart ached with the weight of what he couldn't say. Over the following weeks, Jesse threw himself into the ranch work with renewed intensity. He wanted the place to be beautiful, to be a testament to the effort and care that the McRae family, that Sarah, had invested in it. He worked from sunrise to well past dark, with Marcus and Kurt helping when they could. It was during one of these long days that Jesse discovered the cross. He'd been clearing brush behind the house, cutting back the wild growth that had taken over what must once have been a yard. Near a large oak tree, his machete struck something solid. Wood, not vegetation. Jesse knelt and carefully pulled away the overgrown grass and weeds. What emerged was a small wooden cross, perhaps 2 feet tall, weathered grey by years of exposure but still standing. Carved into the wood, still barely legible, were letters TM plus SM. Below that, a date, April 1985. Jesse sat back on his heels, his mind working through the implications. The initials were his and Sarah's. The date, April 1985. Tommy would have been about 2 years old then. Jesse pulled out his phone, a cheap prepaid model he'd bought in town, and calculated. If Sarah had been pregnant in early 1985, due in April, and this cross marked the spot, his breath caught. A daughter. They'd had a daughter, or would have had a daughter, and she hadn't survived. Sarah had been pregnant, had lost the baby, and Jesse hadn't been there. Hadn't known. Had been off drinking and drifting, while Sarah had buried their child alone beneath this tree. Jesse knelt in the tall grass and wept. For the daughter he'd never known. For Sarah, who had endured so much without him. For Tommy, who had been 2 years old when his mother lost a sibling he would never meet. For all the moments and people and possibilities that had been buried by Jesse's cowardice and absence. When he could finally stand, Jesse cleared the area around the cross carefully, treating it as the sacred ground it was. He cut the grass short, removed the weeds, exposed the full cross to sunlight for the first time in years. Then he sat beneath the oak tree and called Kurt. "I found something," he said when the old man answered. "Can you come by?" Kurt arrived within an hour, and Jesse showed him the cross. The old man's face softened with understanding and grief. "I remember," Kurt said quietly. "Sarah was about 6 months along. Something went wrong. The baby came too early. Little girl. She lived for maybe an hour, then slipped away. Sarah was devastated. The whole town mourned with her." He looked at Jesse. "You didn't know." "How would I?" Jesse's voice was raw. "I was off being a drunk in some city I can't even remember. Probably passed out under a bridge while my wife buried our daughter." "You didn't know you had a wife," Kurt pointed out gently. "You didn't know about Tommy. You can't take responsibility for not being there when you didn't know there was anywhere to be. I should have known. I should have come back. I should have—" Jesse couldn't finish the sentence. They sat together in the shade of the oak tree while the afternoon sun tracked across the sky. Finally, Kurt spoke again. "You planning to tell Tommy about all this?" "I have to. Sarah's letter said if I was back for good, I should tell him. Let him decide if he wants a relationship with me. And are you? Back for good?" Jesse looked at the ranch, at the work they'd done, at the cross marking the daughter he'd never known. "I don't have anywhere else to go. And even if I did, I think I'm done running." "Then you need to finish what you started here," Kurt said, gesturing toward the house. "Make this place whole again. Show him you're serious. Then tell him the truth and let the chips fall where they may." Marcus arrived shortly after, bringing supplies from town. Jesse told him about the cross, about the daughter, about the weight of grief that seemed to multiply with each discovery. The young man listened with the quiet attention that had become his trademark. "That's a lot to carry," Marcus said finally. "All this history, all this pain. You sure you want to tell the Reverend? Seems like it might be easier for both of you if you just kept quiet." "Easier isn't the same as right," Jesse said. "I've spent 40 years doing what was easier. It's time I did what was right." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we better get this place finished. Can't have you showing your son a half-done ranch." Over the next 3 weeks, the 3 men worked with focused determination. They completed the barn roof, reinforced the structure, painted it the traditional red that barns had been for generations. They finished the fence line all the way around the property. They repaired the well pump and cleared the property of debris and overgrowth. The house received the most attention. They replaced broken windows, patched the roof, fixed the plumbing enough that the bathroom was functional again. Jesse painted the exterior a clean white with dark green trim around the windows. He rebuilt the porch, replacing every board, and installed a new swing, a wooden bench suspended on chains, the kind Sarah's letters mentioned sitting on during quiet evenings. As he worked on the swing, Jesse carved something into the underside where it wouldn't be visible unless someone looked specifically for it. Sarah, I'm sorry. I came home. Jesse. He also spent time writing his own letter to Tommy, drafting and redrafting it dozens of times. How did you explain 40 years of absence in a few pages? How did you ask for forgiveness while acknowledging you didn't deserve it? In the end, Jesse kept it simple, honest, and brief. He explained who he was, why he'd left, where he'd been, and why he'd come back. He asked nothing, promised nothing, simply laid out the truth and left the response to Tommy. One evening, with the ranch looking better than it had in decades, Jesse sat on the new porch swing with Kurt and Marcus. The three men drank coffee and watched the sun set over the prairie in comfortable silence. It looks good, Marcus said finally. Really good. Your family would be proud. Sarah would be, Kurt agreed. Your father too. This place looks like a McRae ranch again. Jesse thought about the photograph on the mantel, about Sarah's letters, about Tommy's childhood drawings, about the cross beneath the oak tree, and the daughter he'd never known, about the life he'd thrown away and the life he was trying to build. I'm going to tell him, he said quietly. This Sunday after church, I'll ask him to come see the ranch. And then I'll tell him everything. You ready for that? Kurt asked. No, Jesse admitted. But I don't think I'll ever be ready. So I might as well do it now. Marcus cleared his throat. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. The Reverend seems like a good man, fair, understanding. He preaches about forgiveness every week. Seems like he practices it too. I hope you're right, Jesse said. Because if he tells me to leave and never come back, I'm not sure what I'll do. This place is all I have left. You'd honor his wishes, Kurt said firmly. You'd respect what he needs, even if it hurts. That's what being a father means, putting your child's needs ahead of your own. He paused. Even if you're 40 years late to the job. That Sunday, Jesse's hands shook as he drove to church. He'd bathed carefully, trimmed his beard, worn his cleanest clothes. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say 100 times, but the words still felt inadequate. The service passed in a blur. Jesse couldn't focus on Tommy's sermon, though he registered that it was about homecoming and redemption, about the prodigal son returning to his father. The coincidence felt almost cruel in its timing. After the service, as people filed out and gathered in the churchyard, Jesse waited until the crowd thinned. Then he approached Tommy, his heart hammering against his ribs. Reverend Whitfield, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. I was wondering if you might have some time this week to visit the ranch. There's something I need to show you. Something I need to tell you. Tommy looked at him curiously. Of course. I'd be happy to see what you've done with the place. How about Tuesday afternoon? I'm free after 3. Tuesday afternoon would be perfect, Jesse said. He almost extended his hand, then pulled it back, afraid that touching his son would make him break down right there in the churchyard. I'll see you then. As Tommy walked away to greet other parishioners, Jesse stood frozen, watching him go. This was it. In 2 days, he would tell his son the truth, and whatever happened after that would determine whether his return to Redemption Creek was a homecoming or just another ending. Jesse drove back to the ranch and spent the rest of the day preparing. He straightened the house, made sure everything was clean and presentable. He placed Sarah's letters, Tommy's drawings, the photograph, and his own letter on the kitchen table where they would be easy to see, easy to share. That night, lying in his sleeping bag on the floor, he still hadn't bought furniture, hadn't felt he deserved that level of comfort. Jesse stared at the ceiling and thought about the man his son had become. Good, kind, faithful. Everything Jesse wasn't but had always hoped to be. Tomorrow he would work on last-minute details. The day after, Tommy would come and Jesse would tell him the truth. And then, for better or worse, the running would finally be over. Tuesday afternoon arrived with perfect weather, as if the universe was acknowledging the importance of the moment. Clear sky, gentle breeze, temperature hovering in the mid-70s. Jesse had been awake since before dawn, unable to sleep, alternating between panic and resignation. He'd spent the morning doing final checks. The house was clean, the yard neat, the barn standing proud with its fresh paint. Everything looked as good as it could look, given the limitations of time and money and 3 men's labor. By 2 o'clock, Jesse was sitting on the porch steps, unable to stay inside, unable to concentrate on anything except the sound of every vehicle that passed on the distant highway. At 3:15, a sedan turned into the driveway, and Jesse's heart began to race. Tommy emerged from the driver's side, and a woman, his wife, Jesse realized, got out from the passenger seat. She was tall and slender, with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. Tommy waved as they approached. "Hope we're not late," Tommy called out. Emily wanted to come along. She loved seeing old places brought back to life. "Not at all," Jesse said, standing. His legs felt unsteady. "Welcome, both of you." Emily shook his hand with a warm grip. "It's lovely to meet you properly, Jesse. Tom has mentioned the work you've been doing out here." Jesse gave them a tour, showing them the barn, the fence line, the well, the cleared property. Tommy seemed genuinely impressed, commenting on the craftsmanship, the attention to detail, the respect shown to the original structure. "You've done remarkable work," Tommy said as they walked back toward the house. "This place was a ruin 6 months ago. Now it looks like a working ranch again." "Had help," Jesse said. "Marcus Webb and Kurt Brennan. Couldn't have done it without them." "Kurt Brennan," Tommy said with a smile. "I know Kurt, good man. He used to tell me stories about the McRae family when I was a boy, about how they'd worked this land for generations." Jesse's throat tightened. "Did he?" "Said they were good people, hard workers, the kind who kept their word and honored their commitments." Tommy looked around the property. "I'm glad to see the McRae name back on this land, even if you're only distantly related to the original family." Jesse led them to the porch, where the new swing hung in the late afternoon light. "Have a seat," he said. "Please." Tommy and Emily sat on the swing, and it held their weight easily, swaying gently with the motion. Jesse remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides, his prepared words suddenly inadequate. "This is beautiful work," Emily said, running her hand along the armrest. "You built this yourself?" "I did." Jesse's voice was hoarse. He cleared his throat. "There's something. I need to show you something. Both of you. And I need to tell you something that's going to be difficult to hear." Tommy's expression shifted from pleasant interest to concern. "All right. We're listening." Jesse went inside and returned with 2 letters, Sarah's final message to him and his own letter to Tommy, and the bundle of original letters from the cedar box. He handed them to Tommy with trembling hands. "Reverend, there's no easy way to say this, and I'm not going to try to soften it or make it easier." Jesse took a breath. "My name is Jesse McRae. I'm your father." The swing stopped moving. Tommy sat frozen, the letters clutched in his hands, his face draining of color. Emily's hand went to her husband's arm, steadying him. "My father is dead," Tommy said quietly. "He died before I was born, or shortly after. He was sick. He couldn't stay." "Your father left when you were 3 months old," Jesse said, forcing himself to meet Tommy's eyes. "Because he was sick, yes, but not the way you think. He was sick with war and rage and shame, and he was afraid of what he might do if he stayed, so he ran. And he kept running for 40 years, until he spent his last $15 on this ranch at a tax auction. Not even knowing it was his own land he was buying back." Tommy opened the first letter, Sarah's final message. Jesse watched his son's face as he read, saw the shock, the confusion, the dawning understanding. Emily read over his shoulder, her expression a mixture of compassion and wariness. When Tommy finished Sarah's letter, he looked up at Jesse with eyes that mirrored his own. "You're saying you're Jesse McRae, my biological father, the one who left my mother alone with a baby?" "Yes. And you've been sitting in my church for weeks, listening to me preach, and you never said anything." "I didn't know you were my son until 3 weeks ago," Jesse said. I found your adoption papers. I found Sarah's letter telling me about you. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you ever since." Tommy stood abruptly, the swing swaying empty behind him. He walked to the porch railing and stood there, his back to Jessie, his shoulders rigid with tension. Emily remained on the swing, looking between her husband and Jessie with careful assessment. "Tom," she said softly, "maybe you should read the other letters. Hear the whole story before you react." "The whole story," Tommy repeated without turning around. "The whole story is that my father abandoned my mother when she was 23 years old with a 3-month-old baby. The whole story is that she waited for him for years and he never came back. The whole story is that she had to give me up for adoption because she couldn't manage on her own. That's the whole story. That's part of it," Jessie said quietly. "But there's more." Tommy finally turned around, and Jessie saw tears on his son's face. "She never told me you came back," Tommy said, his voice breaking. "In all the years before she died, she never mentioned that you'd returned to Redemption Creek." "I didn't," Jessie said. "Until 3 months ago, I'd never been back. Not once in 40 years. Sarah was gone before I found my way home. The weight of that, 40 years of absence, Sarah dying without ever seeing Jessie return, settled over all 3 of them like a heavy blanket." "Why now?" Tommy asked, the question filled with pain and anger and confusion. "Why come back now after all this time? After she's gone, after I've lived my whole life without you?" "Because I finally hit bottom," Jessie said honestly. "Because I had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. Because I was homeless and broken and used my last few dollars to buy a piece of land that turned out to be the home I ran away from." He gestured at the ranch. "I didn't come back for redemption. I came back to die quietly. But I found Sarah's letters and your drawings, and I learned I had a son, and suddenly dying quietly wasn't enough anymore." Tommy sank back onto the swing, his head in his hands. Emily put her arm around him, and they sat there while the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. "I need time," Tommy finally said, his voice muffled. "I need to think about this, process it. I've preached about forgiveness my whole adult life, but this," he looked up at Jessie, "you're asking me to forgive 40 years of absence. To accept a father who shows up when I'm 42 years old. I don't know if I can do that." "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Jessie said. "I'm just asking you to know the truth. Whatever you decide after that, I'll respect it. If you want me to leave Redemption Creek, I'll leave. If you never want to see me again, I'll stay away. This is your choice, Tommy, not mine." "Thomas," his son corrected quietly. "Everyone calls me Thomas or Tom now. Tommy was a little boy who waited for his father. I'm not that boy anymore." "Thomas," Jessie repeated, accepting the correction. It was fair. The boy who had drawn pictures of cowboys was gone, replaced by the man who stood before him now. Thomas read through the bundle of Sarah's letters, his hands shaking as he turned each page. Jessie watched his son's face cycle through emotions, grief, anger, confusion, something that might have been understanding. When Thomas finally set the letters down, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather Bible, the kind ministers carried. "I want to show you something," Thomas said. He opened the Bible to a marked page, and tucked inside was a small photograph, creased and faded from years of handling. It was the same photograph Jessie had found in the kitchen drawer, himself at 23, in his military uniform. Standing beside Sarah, the image Jessie kept on his mantle. "My mother gave me this when I was 8 years old," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "She said this was my father, that he was a good man who got hurt in the war and had to go away. I've looked at this photograph almost every day of my life. I memorized every detail, your face, your uniform, the way you stood. I created an entire person in my mind based on this one image." He looked up at Jessie, tears streaming down his face. "And when you walked into my church 6 weeks ago, I shook your hand. I talked to you. I worked beside you at the church lunch. And I never recognized you. I looked at you and saw just another drifter who'd bought the old McRae place. I didn't see my father." The pain in those words cut Jessie deeper than any accusation could have. "I didn't recognize you either," he said quietly. "I left when you were 3 months old. I had no idea what you'd look like as a man. And you have your mother's coloring, her features. I saw you and just saw a kind reverend who reminded me of what I should have been. Why didn't you come back? Thomas asked, the question raw and urgent. I know my mother's letter explained some of it, but I need to hear it from you. Why didn't you come back sooner? Why did it take 40 years? Jesse sat down on the porch steps, suddenly too tired to stand. Because I was a coward. Because I was ashamed of what I'd done, of what the war had made me into. Because every day I didn't come back made it harder to imagine coming back at all. Time has a way of making distance permanent if you let it. He looked at his son. I don't have a good reason, Thomas. I just have the truth. I was broken and scared and convinced that you and your mother were better off without me. Were we? Thomas asked sharply. Better off? My mother worked herself to exhaustion, trying to keep this ranch running alone. She had to give me up for adoption because she couldn't do it by herself. She buried a daughter. Did you know about that? Did you know you had a daughter who died when she was an hour old? I found the cross beneath the oak tree, Jesse said. 3 weeks ago. I've been sitting out there most nights since, trying to process that I had a daughter I never knew about. Thomas stood and paced the length of the porch. My mother loved you. Even after everything, she loved you. She told me that when she was dying. She said she understood why you left, that she'd forgiven you years ago. But I watched her struggle. I saw how hard it was for her. And you were out there somewhere, doing what? Drinking, drifting. Living in some other world while we were here trying to survive. Yes, Jesse said simply. All of that. I was selfish and broken and too stubborn to get help. I convinced myself you were better off without me. And I used that conviction to justify never facing what I'd done. Emily stood and moved to her husband's side. Tom, she said gently, maybe we should take a step back. This is a lot to process all at once. It's 40 years all at once, Thomas said, but his voice had lost some of its sharp edge. It is, Emily agreed, and you don't have to decide how to feel about it right now. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be hurt. You're also allowed to be curious, to want to know more. She looked at Jesse, and Jesse is allowed to have made mistakes and still want to make amends, even if it's too late to undo the damage. Thomas sank back onto the swing, looking exhausted. I've spent my entire adult life preaching about forgiveness and redemption. I've counseled dozens of people through family conflicts, told them that it's never too late to heal broken relationships. And now I'm faced with my own test, and I don't know if I can practice what I preach. You don't have to forgive me, Jesse said. You don't owe me anything. I'm the one who owes you an explanation, an apology, a lifetime of presence that I can never give back. What do you want from me? Thomas asked, looking directly at Jesse. What are you hoping for here? Nothing, Jesse said honestly. I'm not hoping for anything. I just wanted you to know the truth. I wanted you to know that your father didn't leave because he didn't love you. He left because he loved you too much to risk hurting you. It was the wrong choice, but it came from the right place. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hand absently touching the photograph in his Bible. I need time, he finally said. I need to think about this, pray about it. Talk to Emily. I can't just accept this and move on like it's simple. Take all the time you need, Jesse said. But, Thomas continued, looking up, I'm willing to try. I don't know what that looks like yet. I don't know if I can ever truly forgive you or if we can build any kind of relationship. But I'm willing to at least try. Something in Jesse's chest loosened just slightly. Not hope, he wasn't ready for that, but possibility. That's more than I deserve. Emily helped Thomas to his feet. As they prepared to leave, Thomas paused and turned back to Jesse. The ranch looks good, he said quietly. She would have been proud of what you've done here. My mother always believed in the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. She was a remarkable woman, Jesse said. I didn't deserve her. No, Thomas agreed. You didn't, but she loved you anyway. That's what remarkable people do. As Thomas and Emily walked toward their car, Thomas stopped one more time. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly in the evening air. The swing is nice work. She always wanted one. Jesse watched them drive away, and only then did he allow himself to cry, deep, racking sobs that shook his entire frame. Not tears of relief or joy, but tears of grief for all the years lost. For the woman who had loved him, for the son who was willing to give him a chance he knew he didn't deserve. When the tears finally stopped, Jesse walked to the oak tree where the small cross stood. He sat beneath the branches as darkness fell, thinking about the daughter he'd never known, the wife he'd lost, and the son who had called the swing "nice work" in a voice that might someday be able to say something warmer. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was a beginning, and after 40 years of running, a beginning was more than Jesse had any right to hope for. 6 months later, early spring arrived at the McRae ranch with a gentleness that felt like blessing. The snow had melted weeks earlier, revealing the careful work of the previous season. Green shoots pushed through the earth, wildflowers prepared to bloom, and the prairie grass grew tall and sweet in the warming air. Jesse stood on his porch in the early morning light, coffee cup in hand, and watched the sun rise over land that no longer felt borrowed or temporary. This was home now, in a way no place had been for 4 decades. He'd made it through a Montana winter, his first in longer than he could remember, and emerged on the other side still standing, still sober, still present. The house behind him was properly furnished now, with donations from church members and purchases made with money earned from odd jobs around town. A bed in the bedroom, a table and chairs in the kitchen, a couch in the living room. Not much, but enough. The photograph of himself and Sarah still held pride of place on the mantel, but it was no longer alone. Beside it sat a new picture, taken just last month. Jesse, Thomas, Emily, and their 2 children standing on this very porch, smiling at the camera. Past and present connected. Thomas came by every other Sunday after morning services, usually bringing Emily and the kids, Anna, age 8, and Michael, age 6. Jesse's grandchildren, though they didn't call him Grandpa yet. They called him Mr. Jesse, and that was fine. He was content to earn his place in their lives slowly, carefully, proving through consistent presence that he was someone they could count on. The children loved the ranch. They chased chickens through the yard. Jesse had bought 4 laying hens from a neighbor and climbed on the fence rails and explored the barn under Jesse's watchful eye. Anna asked constant questions about everything, while Michael was quieter, more observant, reminding Jesse painfully of Tommy at that age. Though he only knew that from photographs and imagination, Marcus still came several times a week. Though the heavy restoration work was mostly complete, the young man had become something like family, filling a space Jesse hadn't known was empty. They worked together on ongoing maintenance, planning improvements for spring planting, talking about Marcus's dreams of eventually running his own ranch someday. "You've got a good sense for the land," Jesse told him one afternoon as they mended fence in the south pasture. "You'll make a fine rancher when your time comes," Marcus grinned. "Learned from the best. You and Kurt both." Kurt visited every Wednesday afternoon without fail, arriving at 2 o'clock as regular as a clock. He and Jesse would sit on the porch and drink coffee and talk about horses, weather, memories, and the slow work of building a life worth living. Sometimes Marcus joined them, and the 3 generations would sit together in comfortable silence, watching the prairie grass wave in the wind. "You've done good here, Jesse," Kurt said one particularly warm afternoon. Tom McRae would be proud. Sarah, too. Jesse thought about that often. Whether Sarah would be proud or merely understanding, whether pride was something he'd earned or was still working toward. He liked to think she'd approve of the ranch's restoration, of his sobriety, 6 months and counting, of his careful, respectful relationship with their son. One Sunday, Thomas asked if he could lead a small service at the ranch for family and close friends. 20 people came, sitting on blankets in the yard while Thomas preached about redemption and homecoming, about the long journey back to oneself. Jesse sat with Anna and Michael, who nestled against him on either side, their small, warm bodies, a trust he handled like precious china. After the service, there was food and fellowship, and Jesse found himself surrounded by community in a way he never had been. These were Sarah's people, the ones who had helped her when he hadn't. They'd been cautious with him at first, watchful, but over the months they'd softened. He'd proven himself through steady work and quiet presence, through showing up day after day without disappearing. He volunteered now at the church, fixing whatever broke, helping with youth programs, carefully supervised, earning trust incrementally. He worked at the food bank on Thursdays and helped Eleanor at the store when shipments came in. He was rebuilding not just a ranch, but a place in the community, thread by careful thread. His conversations with Thomas deepened slowly. They talked about Sarah, sharing memories and filling in gaps for each other. Thomas told stories about growing up with the Whitfields, about learning to preach, about meeting Emily. Jesse shared carefully edited stories about the war, about the years of drifting, about what he'd learned from hitting bottom and climbing back up. They didn't talk about forgiveness directly. That word was too big, too fraught. But Jesse saw acceptance growing in his son's eyes, saw the way Thomas's shoulders relaxed when Jesse was around, the way he trusted Jesse with his children. That was enough. That was everything. One quiet afternoon, Jesse drove to the cemetery behind the Methodist church. He'd been there several times over the past months, always alone, always bringing whatever wildflowers were blooming on the ranch. Sarah's grave was simple, just her name, her dates, and beneath those, beloved mother, faithful friend, she loved well. Jesse knelt in the grass and spoke to her the way he always did, as if she might somehow hear him. He told her about Thomas, about how their son had grown into a good man. Told her about the grandchildren, about Marcus and Kurt, about the ranch looking the way she'd always wanted it to look. He thanked her for the letters, for waiting as long as she had, for raising their son with love even when Jesse had given her every reason to teach him hate instead. "I came home," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know it's 40 years too late. I know you're not here to see it. But I came home, Sarah, and I'm staying." The sun was setting when Jesse finally drove back to the ranch. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw Marcus's truck already parked there and Kurt's beside it. Through the window he could see Thomas inside with the children, probably starting dinner. Emily's laugh carried across the yard. Jesse sat in his truck for a moment, taking in the scene. The house, with its fresh white paint glowing in the evening light. The barn standing solid and proud. The fence line running true all the way around the property. The porch swing moving gently in the breeze. And inside, through the windows, the people who had become his family, chosen or born, blood or bond. He remembered sitting on these same porch steps 6 months ago, broken and alone, reading letters from a woman who had waited for him. Remembered believing he'd come here to die quietly, forgotten. Remembered thinking redemption was something beyond his reach. He'd been wrong about that last part. Redemption wasn't a destination you arrived at. It was a direction you moved toward, one day at a time, one choice at a time. One moment of showing up when you could have disappeared instead. Jesse climbed out of the truck and walked toward the house. Anna saw him through the window and waved enthusiastically. Thomas looked up and smiled. Not the full, unguarded smile of complete forgiveness, but something real and warm nonetheless. Kurt raised his coffee mug in greeting. Marcus called out, "About time you got back. We started without you." Standing on the threshold of his own front door, Jesse McRae felt something he hadn't felt in longer than memory served. He felt like he belonged, like this place and these people were his, and he was theirs. Like home was finally real and solid beneath his feet. The prairie wind carried the scent of spring growth and new beginnings. The sun painted everything gold, the way it always did at this hour, making the ordinary into something sacred. Jesse stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Surrounded by life and laughter and the possibility of all the tomorrows he'd finally stopped running from. The ranch that nobody wanted, bought with his last $15, had given him back everything he'd thrown away, and more besides. It had given him purpose, community, family, and the chance to finally become the man Sarah had always believed he could be. Jesse McRae had spent 40 years running from his past. But in the end, his past had been waiting right here where he'd left it, ready to forgive, ready to heal, ready to teach him that it's never too late to come home, as long as you're willing to stay.